Welcome to today's expert lecture on the Cold War. My name's Natasha Baker and I'm the marketing manager for Golden Eagle Luxury Trains. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome back our expert speaker for today, Major Gordon Corrigan. So as some of you may know, Major Corrigan served as an officer of the Royal Gurkha Rifles for most of his adult life. And he now works as a military historian and has authored several books on the First and Second World Wars. We've also had the pleasure of hosting him as a guest speaker on lots of different Golden Eagle journeys over the last 10 years. And so, as always, we're delighted to have him back presenting for you today online. So that's it from me, and I hope you enjoy the lecture, and I'll pass you over to Major Corrigan.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and good evening if you're in England, or good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you very much for logging in. Now, this is the second of a two-part series talking about the Cold War. Don't worry if you haven't seen the first lecture, because each one stands alone. But in the last lecture, which I talked about the Yalta conference, and that was what laid the foundation for the Cold War. And this evening I'd like to talk about the Cold War itself. If you're anywhere near my age, you grew up under it. It shaped international relations for almost 50 years, and the effects of it still linger today. It lasted from the end of the Second World War until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. There were many times when it might have gone hot, but it was actually fought out in the spheres of propaganda and economics, politics, and militarily by surrogacy outside Europe. Now, the Yalta Conference, it was in February 1945. It's the last conference of the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, before the end of the Second World War. And the aim was to decide how the final phase of the war should be fought and what would be the shape of Europe after the war. Now, the British and the Americans going into that conference had a very weak hand indeed, because they had no common agenda. On the other hand, Stalin knew exactly what he wanted, and indeed he got most of it. The Second World War, as far as we in the West are concerned, ended on the 7th of May, 1945, when the Germans surrendered to General Eisenhower at Reims, or Reims as we call it. But in the East, because Stalin insisted on a separate surrender to the Russians, to the eastern half of Europe, it's the 8th of May rather than the 7th. And the result of the Second World War and what was decided at the Yalta Conference was that what Churchill called an iron curtain descended over Europe. Stalin got his buffer, that line of states controlled by the Soviets, which would act as a buffer against any aggression towards the Soviet Union. And that was the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the whole of Poland, the eastern half of Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Germany, as we know, was divided into three zones. The Soviets would occupy the eastern half of the country, the British would occupy the northwest, the Americans the southwest, and the French would have a zone on the west. Berlin, 110 miles inside eastern Germany, Soviet-occupied eastern Germany, would also be divided into four zones. The Soviets would occupy the eastern half of the city, the French the north, the British the centre, and the Americans the south. Now, there was access for the Allies, for the French, the British, and the Americans from West Germany to Berlin, because West Berlin didn't really produce any food. It wasn't agricultural. So all the food, or most of the food that was eaten by the West Berliners, had to be imported from the West. And in June 1948, the Soviets decided to flex their muscles. And they closed all the road and rail and water access to West Berlin from the West. And they said, the West can't protect you. We're the only people who can protect you. And they issued ration tickets. And of course, those ration tickets could only be redeemed in the Soviet zone. Well, clearly the Western Allies weren't going to put up with that. And so the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Force between them flew in 5,600 tons every day into West Berlin. And they landed at the airport of Gatow, which was in the British sector, Tempelhof, which was in the American sector, and a new airport, Tegel, which they built very, very quickly. So every day, 5,500 tons, sometimes a little bit more, would be flown in, mainly food, but also some consumer goods as well. Stalin at one point considered blocking the air channel as well, but his general staff advised him not to do it. They said, look, the British and the Americans' aeroplanes are better than ours, and their anti-aircraft measures are also better than ours. If we try that, we won't win. And eventually, after almost a year, on the 12th of May, 1949 rather, the Soviets gave up and the road and rail access was reopened. The Soviets did retain one foothold in West Berlin. You'll remember I said that the city was divided. But the foothold they had in the west was Spandau prison. Now, you'll remember that at the end of the war, the heads of the German armed forces and the German departments of government, many of them were put on trial at Nuremberg for war crimes. Those found guilty, some were executed. Those that were sentenced to terms of imprisonment were imprisoned in Spandau prison in West Berlin. The staff of the prison, the governors, the prison warders, the cooks, the gardeners, all the staff were equally divided between the French, the British, the Americans and the Soviets. There was a military guard around the prison, and that was again provided by the four powers, and each power did 3 months. So the Americans would guard it for 3 months, they would hand over to the British for 3 months, they would hand over to the French, they'd hand over to the Soviets, and so on. Now by May 1961, really the only prison, sorry, by 1966 rather, the only prisoner still in there was Rudolf Hess. All the rest had served their time, they'd been released. Now, the British and the Americans would have released Hess. They thought he'd been sentenced to life imprisonment, but actually he'd done enough. And he wasn't as evil as many of his Nazi friends, Nazi compatriots. He'd flown to England in May 1941. Now, we still don't really know what all that was about. There are all sorts of various theories. So he'd been arrested then, he'd been held by the British. He left Germany long before the Wannsee Conference, which was in January 42. And it was at the Wannsee Conference where the Germans decided what they called the final solution, when they decided to murder the Jewish population of Europe. So Hess wasn't involved in that. And the Western view was, well, he's done his time, we'll let him go. Well, of course, the Soviets wouldn't agree to that, because if Hess was released, then there was no reason to keep that little foothold in West Berlin, their eye on the West. He was a naughty old boy, Hess. I commanded the guard there on one occasion when I was in Berlin, and the soldiers were in towers round the walls, and Hess was allowed out every afternoon to walk in the garden. Now, the rules were very clear. You were not allowed to have any communication whatsoever with the prisoner. You couldn't speak to him, and if he spoke to you, you couldn't answer. And what Hess would do when he was out for his walk around the garden, he'd look up to the tower and he'd say, "Hey, Tommy." And Tommy would feel, the soldier would feel sorry for the old boy, and he'd throw him a packet of cigarettes. This was in the day when everybody smoked, and the army got duty-free cigarettes. And Hess would smoke the entire packet, and then he'd report the soldier to the governor for breaking the rules. So the wretched soldier was in big trouble for breaking the rules. And he'd always try that with the first guard. Of course, once you knew about it, it didn't happen again. And he tried it with the Americans, he tried it with the French. He didn't get any joy with the Soviets. I suppose the poor old boy, it was the only source of amusement he had. He eventually, of course, committed suicide in 1987, aged 93. Now, you'll hear all sorts of conspiracy theories. One is that the most incredible one, which I think is still on the internet, is that Hess was murdered by British agents disguised as American soldiers. The Americans were doing the guard at the time, and they murdered him. And the reason they did that was that Hess was about to expose evidence of British atrocities during the war. Well, the trouble with that theory is, first of all, if there had been British atrocities, Hess wouldn't have known anything about them. And secondly, he hanged himself in the gardener's hut. Now, the gardener's hut was under the gaze of, I think it was 7 towers, all containing soldiers. And no one could have got into that hut, other than Hess, without being seen. So forget all these conspiracy theories. I think he just had enough. He was 93. He had no chance of getting out. He'd had enough. And he strangled himself using the flex from a standard lamp. Well, after the Berlin Airlift, and it was clear that relations between the East and the West were actually getting worse. And this led to the formation in 1949 of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, initially, this was the British, the Canadians, and the Americans agreeing that they would defend Europe against Soviet aggression. And then more and more countries joined. And they're the countries that are in green. The British wanted the Spaniards to join. The other members said no. Spain was a dictatorship, and they wouldn't have it. And it wasn't until Franco died and Spain became eventually a democracy that they did join, and they are now members of NATO. The British did, on the other hand, manage to get Portugal in. Now, Portugal was also a dictatorship under Salazar, but Portugal was an old ally of the British. In fact, the oldest treaty, which is still in force today, is the Treaty of Windsor of 1386 between England and Portugal. Now, the NATO agreement was originally, it was a political agreement. There wasn't a unified command. It was simply an agreement that all those countries, if there was aggression from the East, those countries would defend Europe. And the important thing was, the vital thing was Article 5. Now, Article 5 of the NATO agreement said that an attack on any member would be regarded as an attack on them all. Now, it's only actually been brought into play once, and that was when the trade towers in America were attacked in September 2001, and Article 5 was then imposed. But that's the critical thing. And that actually always made the Soviets think that if they attacked one member, all the members would ruin. But it's not a unified command as yet. And what made it a unified command was the Korean War. Now, the Japanese had occupied Korea since 1910. And when Japan was defeated at the end of the Second World War, Korea was divided, or temporarily divided, or they thought temporarily divided, between the Soviets occupying the northern half of the peninsula and the Americans occupying the southern half. And the agreement was that there would be free and fair elections. And the thought was, at least in the West, that the country would be unified under a democratic form of government. But that is not, of course, what happened. The Soviets established a communist government under Kim Il-sung in the north and then withdrew. And there were elections in the south, and it was a quasi-democratic regime in the south. And then on the 25th of June, 1950, the North invaded the South. And this matter was brought up in the United Nations, and it was decided by the Security Council of the United Nations that there would be a United Nations military force that would go in to support the South. Now, they were only able to do that because the Soviets were boycotting the UN. And this was all over the question of the People's Republic of China, which we'll come to later. Because if the Soviet Union had not been boycotting the UN, they would have vetoed the question of a UN force. Now, the Americans and the British would probably have gone anyway, but they wouldn't have had quite the legitimacy that they had by it being a United Nations operation. It was effectively an American operation, really. There were 600,000 South Korean troops involved of varying standards of training and equipment and ability, 300,000 American troops, 14,000 British Commonwealth troops, and 3,000 others. And initially it was all going very well. And the UN was pushing the North Koreans back further and further north. And they were approaching the Yalu River, which is the border between Korea and China. And at that point, in came the Chinese. And 1.75 million men of the Chinese army descended across the Yalu into North Korea. China said these are volunteers. Well, they weren't volunteers. They were units of the Chinese Communist Army. General MacArthur, who's commanding the UN force, an American general, he wants to use nuclear weapons against China and destroy the bridges across the Yalu. President Truman sacked MacArthur, rightly. If MacArthur had nuked China, the Chinese didn't have nuclear weapons, but the Soviets had. The Soviets would undoubtedly have come in to assist, and we'd have ended up with World War III. And President Truman, and indeed the West, wanted to localize the Korean War, and that is what they managed to do. MacArthur is sacked. He's replaced by General Westmoreland. And eventually there is an armistice in 1953 along the 38th parallel, more or less, which is more or less where it all started from. And that was an armistice. There's never been a peace treaty. There isn't one yet. And what is called the DMZ, as called in America, the DMZ over here, the demilitarized zone, which is the area between the north and the south. It's probably the most heavily fortified bit of land in the world, where very tall North Koreans look across at very tall South Koreans, and each side plays propaganda, and occasionally the South sends balloons, propaganda balloons in. And this is what turned NATO from being just a political agreement where the various countries had agreed that they would defend Western Europe into a unified command. In other words, there'd be one commander, one overall headquarters, and all the contributing nations' forces would be under that headquarters. And there would be, it was agreed, standardization. Now, there was only some standardization. The original idea was that everybody would have the same tanks, same weapons, same caliber, same sort of ammunition, same vehicles, so that everything was interchangeable. Now, that actually didn't happen because each nation had its own weapons industry, armaments industry, which it didn't want to lose out on. But there was a lot of standardization in staff work, little things. When you mark a map up, you mark enemy positions, you mark tanks, you mark artillery pieces, anti-tank guns, and all the rest of it. And each nation had a separate symbol. So standardization, everybody in NATO uses the same symbol. So if an American officer looks at a Belgian map, then he knows the Belgians are using exactly the same symbols as the Americans are. So that sort of standardization did happen, not as much as hoped, but it did. The overall commander would be American. He'd be an American general, and the deputy commander would be a British general, and that is still the case to this day. Of course, the United States troops in Germany and the British troops in Germany would be part of that. They would be under command of NATO, and other countries would earmark units to be part of NATO. The French also, for a while, were part of the military organization of NATO, although they withdrew later on. Well, then in 1952, in Egypt, there is a coup, and an army-led coup ousts King Farouk, who was the king of Egypt, who was a British client. Now, he's gone. 1954, Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser becomes the president of Egypt. He was an Arab nationalist. He was anti-Israel. He wanted to see Israel wiped off the face of the map. He was anti the West. His army badly needed re-equipping and retraining. And the obvious people to do that would normally have been the British. But the British are very concerned about Nasser, and they're not prepared to arm him or to train him. So Nasser turns to the Americans. And the Americans say, yes, we will arm you, but we will retain control over those weapons. Because the Americans knew jolly well that if Nasser was re-equipped and retrained, the first thing he would do would be attack Israel. That's unquestionably what he would have done. Well, of course, they're not prepared to accept American control of their weapons, so they turn to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union says, yes, well, certainly, we will equip you and train you. And a result of that, with the Egyptians turning to the Soviet Union, the British and the Americans withdrew funding for the Aswan Dam. Now, the Aswan Dam project was an enormous project, enormously expensive project, designed to control the annual flood of the Nile. Because some years there was too much water, other years there was a drought. And the Aswan Dam project was going to control that. And it was enormously expensive, mostly paid for by the British and the Americans. So they've said, right, we're not going to pay that. And in retaliation, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal belonged largely to the British and the French. And of course, strategically incredibly important for anyone wanting to trade from Europe to the east. It goes through the Suez Canal. And now we entered a period of collusion where the British, the French and the Israelis collude. And the agreement they come to in great secret is that the Israelis will invade Egypt as a preemptive strike. The view being that Egypt is about to attack Israel, which actually they were. We, as Israel, will attack first on a preemptive move. Whereupon the British and the French will seize the Suez Canal. They'll go in to protect the Suez Canal, prevent it from being damaged by either side. And that is what happened. Israel invades Egypt, in go the British and the French. It's interesting that for that operation, the British used 5 aircraft carriers, and that wasn't the only 5 they had. They had others as well. 5 aircraft carriers. We only have 2 at the moment, but admittedly they are the most modern, newest aircraft carriers in the world. But nevertheless, 4 cruisers, 22 destroyers, 8 frigates, 5 submarines, 16 battalions of infantry, 3 parachute battalions, 2 armoured regiments, 8 artillery regiments, and 25 squadrons of the Royal Air Force, plus, of course, all the supporting arms. So it was a pretty major military operation. And at first, everything appeared to be going terribly well. The British were zipping down the canal, brushing aside Egyptian defences. The French were coming up from the other end. But then America announced her disapproval. And they instigated a run on the pound, a very serious run on the pound. The Soviet Union, of course, also disapproved, and they threatened to nuke England. Now, that was ignored by the British. That was a bluff, because the Soviets knew jolly well that if they attacked England with nuclear weapons, they would get a lot worse back, because at that time, British nuclear capability was at least equal to and probably superior to that of the Soviet Union. But the run on the pound was very, very serious, because if that went on, Britain would be bankrupt. The trouble was that the British hadn't told the Americans what they were going to do, because they were afraid of a leak. The Secretary of State, who was Dulles, American Secretary of State, said he was ill, he wasn't there. And he said afterwards that if he hadn't been ill and away from his desk, he would never have allowed it to happen. He would never have allowed the run on the pound to happen. And President Eisenhower in his memoirs says that the biggest mistake of his presidency was in not supporting the British. But the result, of course, was a humiliating withdrawal on the part of the British, an indication to other Middle Eastern countries that actually the British lion was toothless. And a lot of the problems that have arisen in the Middle East since perhaps wouldn't have arisen if the British and the French had been allowed to go on what they did. But as it was, they didn't. Well, in the meanwhile, Stalin has died in 1953, and he is replaced by Khrushchev. And there's a little bit of liberalization. Now, I say it's a relative term, a little bit of liberalization. But in Hungary, the Hungarians think, Stalin's dead. We can get rid of a lot of this Stalinist doctrine. And what started as demonstrations and attempts to change the constitution actually became effectively a revolution, which was put down in a very bloody fashion by the Soviets. And the West didn't do anything, really, because all eyes at this stage were on what was happening in Suez. And then in 1961, up goes the Berlin Wall. Now, as we said, Berlin was divided into the 4 zones, but people could move relatively easily from one zone to the other. And increasingly, people in the West, in the Eastern zone, in the Soviet-controlled zone, were looking at the West and seeing that the standard of living in the West was going up and up and up. And the economy was going up and up and up. And really nothing very much was happening in the East. So more and more Easterners are getting themselves into West Berlin with a view either to staying in West Berlin or to getting into West Germany. And so the communist government of East Germany, East Berlin, Soviets in East Berlin, up went the Berlin Wall. Now, the East German authorities said, we are building this wall to keep criminals, saboteurs and spies from the West coming into the East. In fact, of course, they were building the wall to keep their own people in. And during the life of the Berlin Wall, we're not exactly sure of the numbers, but something like 1,400, probably more, we think about 1,400 East Berliners were shot trying to get them across the wall. There were some quite good ideas. There was a tunnel actually dug under the wall, which worked for quite a while with people getting through, until eventually the Soviets found it, or the East Germans found it, and they blocked it. So up goes the Berlin Wall. So relations are getting worse and worse and worse. And in the early 60s, the Soviets began to think that actually the West is a paper tiger. They'd seen the humiliation of the British at Suez. They'd seen a U-2 spy plane shot down over Ekaterinburg. Now, the U-2 was an American spy plane. It flew at 75,000 feet, far too high for Soviet fighters to get there, and it was thought far too high for anti-aircraft missiles to get there. But actually that wasn't the case, and they shot down a U-2 over Ekaterinburg. The pilot, Gary Powers, bailed out, was arrested, caught, and eventually exchanged. When we go on the Trans-Siberian trip with the wonderful Golden Eagle, we do, one of the museums that we can visit actually has got a chunk of the U-2. Then they'd seen what had happened in the Bay of Pigs. Now, what happened there was that in Cuba, the dictator, a man called Batista. Now, Batista was a thoroughly unpleasant piece of work, but he was our piece of work, if you like. He was a capitalist, he was pro-Western, he was anti-communist. The fact that he was totally incompetent and corrupt as well was immaterial. And there was a revolution in Cuba, and Batista was kicked out and a communist government established. The revolution was led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, and they established a communist government. And of course, they're now looking to the Soviets rather than looking to the West. And another U-2 was shot down over Cuba in 1962. Now, this time the pilot, a man called Anderson, was actually killed. So you put all these things together and you put the failure of the Americans to try and overthrow the communist government of Cuba, the failure of the Bay of Pigs, as it was called. And this was where a group of Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the CIA, had invaded Cuba with the aim of overthrowing the communist regime. It was a disaster. It was badly planned, security was bad, and Cuban defense was an awful lot better than anybody thought it ever would be. So put all these factors together, and to the Soviets, now's the time we can push our luck. We can push a bit, we can start pushing. And they decided to put missiles, ballistic missiles, in Cuba. Now, fortunately, various U-2 flights before the one that was shot down, before Anderson's was shot down, had in fact picked this up. Cuba is 150 miles from Florida. So ballistic missiles in Cuba, nuclear ballistic missiles, could hit anywhere in the United States. So clearly the United States were not going to stand for that. How could they? So President Kennedy ordered a blockade of Cuba. And there was a standoff, very fragile standoff. And eventually Khrushchev blinked first, the Soviets blinked first. And they agreed to withdraw ballistic missiles from Cuba. And as a quid pro quo, the United States gave a public declaration that they would not invade Cuba. They also agreed, but not openly, they also agreed secretly that they would withdraw their own nuclear missiles from Turkey and from Italy. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis was probably the nearest we ever got to the Cold War becoming hot, and it very nearly did, but actually at the end it didn't. Well, Khrushchev was ousted in October 1964, and he went off and retired. The first time any ruler of the Soviet Union, of Russia or the Soviet Union, has ever retired. All the czars were either assassinated or died on their beds. Lenin stayed and obviously died. Stalin stayed and obviously died. So things are lightening a bit. because here is someone who isn't assassinated or murdered or dies of old age. He's allowed to retire. And he is succeeded by a man called Brezhnev, and that's Brezhnev in the middle. And he is the Secretary General of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And he's there from 1964 right up until 1982. While this is happening, the French, who are members of NATO, as we've said, and had troops dedicated to NATO, are getting very fed up with what they call les Anglo-Saxons. They see that there is, or they believe that there is, a United States, United Kingdom alliance, and that alliance is actually operating on their own agenda, and they're not taking into account French sensibilities or the French agenda. So they leave the military bit of Europe. They're not part of it anymore. And they decide to develop their own nuclear weapons, the force de frappe, which, as President de Gaulle says, will now face both ways. Not just east. British nuclear weapons pointed east rhetorically. American missiles face east. The French will face both ways, although how he thought he was ever going to go to war against England and America, I don't know. Now, by leaving the military bit of NATO, that meant that the NATO headquarters had to move from France to Mons in Belgium, the supreme headquarters, Allied powers in Europe, SHAPE, known to us serving at the time as sleepy holidays at public expense, which is a bit unfair, but the headquarters were grossly overstaffed. And the reason for that was that every member of NATO wanted to have a finger in the pie, wanted to have a representative. So the supreme headquarters was grossly inflated staff, and even the regional headquarters, Northern Army Group, Naples and everywhere else, had far more staff officers than they actually needed. Fortunately, that didn't affect its ability to deploy quickly when they had to. Well, in 1968, the chairman of the Czech Communist Party was a man called Dubček. And Dubček realized that there was a certain amount of liberalization going on in the Soviet Union. Now, I say it's relative. And he thought, well, we can liberalize in Czechoslovakia. But the liberalization that he saw was going an awful lot further than the liberalization that Brezhnev was prepared to put up with, Brezhnev in the Soviet Union. Now, Brezhnev tried to compromise. He said to Dubček, don't go as far as that. Dubček ignored him. And the result was that the Soviets invaded into Czechoslovakia. And the Brezhnev doctrine was formulated. And the Brezhnev doctrine said, if socialism is under threat anywhere, we will intervene to prop it up. But to show that they had liberalized a bit, Dubček was not executed. 10 years previously, they'd have shot him. He was simply demoted from being the chairman of the Communist Party to being a forestry official. I suppose if you've been the dictator of a country and then you end up counting oak trees or whatever forestry officials do, it's a bit of a come down, but at least he was still alive. Well, then something happened that really was dramatic, that really did affect history, one of the few sort of tipping points in history, if you like. And that was the question of the People's Republic of China. Now, you'll remember that at the end of the war, when the Security Council was set up, the seat for China was held by the Republic of China, and that's Taiwan. These are the people who were driven off by the communists, by Mao Zedong's rebellion, into Formosa, into Taiwan, and they are the Republic of China. And they're sitting in the seat, in the China seat in the Security Council. The Soviets had for some time, when they were pro-Chinese, and they vary between being on the side of the Chinese and being worried about the Chinese, allied to China, being an unwritten enemy of China. And they had tried to get the communist China into the United Nations, and they'd always failed. It had always been voted down. And President Nixon sees that this cannot go on, that a country the size of China and potentially of the power of China needs to be brought into the cold, out of the cold, rather. And he sent his Secretary of State, Kissinger, on a secret visit to China in July 1971. It was secret. And Kissinger got there and he talked to Zhou Enlai, who was the Chinese Prime Minister. He made a second visit that year, which was not secret. And the result was that in 1971, there was a vote in the United Nations and the Republic of China were replaced by the People's Republic of China, Communist China. Now, fortunately, that membership was a matter for the General Assembly, not for the Security Council. If it had been a member of the Security Council, of course, the Republic of China, Taiwan, would have vetoed it, but that wasn't the case. Membership had to be decided by a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly, and there was that 2/3 majority. The Americans actually voted against it, although they were the people who had instigated it. They voted against it, I think, because they couldn't be seen publicly to be abandoning their longtime ally, the Republic of China. British voted for it. So China is now, Communist China is now on the Security Council and a member of the United Nations, and the Republic of China are out. The United States recognized Communist China the following year, in February 1972. Now, the British, of course, had recognized Communist China from 1949. And the difference is that the British recognize a country de facto. If you're in control, we'll recognize you. We may not like you, but you're there, we'll recognize you. The Americans recognize de jure. If you are the rightful government, we will recognize you, otherwise we won't. And they did not regard the communist government of Mao Zedong as being the rightful government of China until 1972. Now, once the United States recognized communist China, this worried the Soviets, because this was a period when, although China and Russia, or China and the Soviet Union, are both communist, they're very different sorts of communists, and there were all sorts of historical disagreements between Russia and China, border problems, border disputes, which actually still have not been settled to this day. So that worried the Soviets quite a bit. Then 1973, you've got the Yom Kippur War. You've got two client states at war. Egypt, a client state of the USSR, Israel, a client state of the United States. They're at war. You've got the United States Sixth Fleet and the Soviet Mediterranean Squadron circle each other in the Mediterranean. Would the Americans have to come to the rescue of Israel? Would the Soviets have to come to the rescue of Egypt? And when the Israelis encircled the Egyptian Third Army and were poised to destroy it, the Soviets said to the Americans through back channels, because you always keep a back channel open where you can talk unofficially, secretly, to a potential enemy. And the Soviets said, look, if the Third Egyptian Army is destroyed, we will have to intervene. We will have no option. So the Americans said to the Israelis, do not destroy the Egyptian Third Army. And the result of that was that the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, initiated peace talks with the Israelis. And he recognized Israel. Now, the first Arab state to recognize Israel as being a legitimate state. Previously, they'd all said, Israel, illegitimate, doesn't exist, we won't recognize it. Egypt did, and that was a tremendous step forward. And Sadat paid for it with his life, because he was assassinated in October 81 by a fundamentalist Arab army lieutenant. Both sides are involved in what is called the SALT talks, strategic arms limitation talks, which go on really from the early 70s right on through. And what that is about is that both the Americans and the Soviets have got enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world 8 times over. The British have got nuclear weapons sufficient to destroy the world 3 times over. So what they're saying to each other is, look, let's reduce the amount of nuclear weapons we have, because that will reduce the tension. Let's bring them down to only being able to destroy the world 4 times. And the British will reduce theirs so they can only destroy the world 2 times. Now that's, I'm being slightly flippant, But the aim was to reduce the tension between the East and the West. And one of the ways of doing that was to reduce the number of nuclear weapons that each side held. Allied with that is the question of the anti-ballistic missile system. Now, ballistic missiles are exceedingly difficult to deal with. They're supersonic, very difficult to have a proper defense against them. And the Americans were designing or trying to design an anti-ballistic missile system, a system that would shoot down incoming ballistic missiles. Incredibly expensive. And if the Americans were going to do that, then the Soviets would have to do the same thing, and that was going to cost them a huge amount of money. And so these discussions are going on. And then in 1978, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Now, at the time, we all said, this is Soviet expansion, Soviet imperialism, and we armed and trained the Afghans against it. Actually, there's a very good book called Afghanistan. Afghanistan is Russian for someone who served in Afghanistan. And it's written by a man called Roderick Braithwaite, who was the British ambassador to Moscow. And he was allowed unfettered access to Soviet generals, corporals, civil servants. In Afghanistan, he talked to all sorts of people. And he came to the conclusion that actually this was not Soviet imperialism, it was not Soviet expansion. It was the Soviet Union was suckered into Afghanistan by the communist government of Afghanistan in Kabul, who'd said, look, we've got a few problems. That'll be solved quite easily, but only if you come in and save us. So they actually got sucked into it. If you're interested in the history of that part of the world, which obviously you are, Braithwaite wrote another very good book called Across the Moscow River. And he was there when Gorbachev is trying to reform the Soviet Union. A very, very interesting book on that whole period. So Roderick Braithwaite, I've never met him, but he's a very good writer. And of course, being the British ambassador to Moscow, he's in a position to produce a very good analysis of what was going on. But when they invaded Afghanistan, they stayed there for 10 years. And it meant that the West applied sanctions against the Soviet Union. They boycotted the Moscow Olympics of 1980, and they trained and armed the resistance. We created the Taliban, I'm afraid, because that is what these people metamorphosed into. Now, President Reagan of the United States and Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, they, between them, decided that they would support anti-communist movements anywhere in the world, wherever they were, and that they would attack the Soviet economy. They would outspend them. Now, this was a time when the Soviet Union was spending 25% of their GDP on defense. Not only that, but there was an oil glut worldwide, so the price of oil had come down. And as a major export of the Soviet Union, and the source of foreign currency, was oil, there's less money coming in. And along with that, as part of the SALT talks, what were called Star Wars, this question of anti-ballistic missile system has raised its head again with the increased expenditure that the Soviets are going to have to lay out. Well, Brezhnev died. He died in office in 1982, and he's succeeded by Andropov, chap on the left. Andropov had been the chairman of the KGB, the Soviet intelligence service, and he did try to liberalize, but he tried to do it, as he said, in accordance with communist principles. You can't liberalize in accordance with communist principles. I mean, you've got a command economy if you're communist, or you have a market economy. There's nothing in between. So he just couldn't do it. I mean, he tried, but didn't really succeed. And he dies in 1984, and he's succeeded by a man called Chernenko, as the guy on the right. Chernenko was ill. He could hardly speak. He'd had several strokes, but he did do something which was incredibly brave. He dismissed the chief of the general staff. He sacked the professional head of the Red Army. And he did that because the CGS insisted that they must spend less on consumer goods and increase the amount of money being spent on defense so that they could put more into weapon development. Now, as I said, they're already spending 25% on GDP on defense. And Chernenko knew jolly well that if even more money was spent on defense and less on consumer goods, that the public unrest might well blow up into something much more serious. So he sacked them. Well, he died in 1985, and that was the year that American cruise missiles were emplaced in RAF Molesworth in England. And that led to a protest camp outside the wire called the Greenham Common Camp. And it was full of all sorts of extraordinary people, basically peace at any price people. They kept trying to get into the camp. Of course, they couldn't. There was a wire fence around it and it was guarded. But when the missiles deployed on exercise, because they would deploy and they'd go to a training area, it could be Salisbury Plain, it could be Dartmoor, and they would set up. These people would try to follow and they'd try to get in. They'd try to write graffiti on the missiles or place dummy bombs with bomb written on it. There was no attempt at violence. They weren't trying to blow anything up, but they were trying to show that they disapproved. And it was actually quite fun. The UK Gurkha Battalion occasionally had to perform the nuclear convoy escort role, as it was called, and we did that a couple of times. And our job was to, when they deployed, was to go with them, guard them, and prevent any of these Harridans, and they were mainly Harridans, getting at them. Well, of course, we couldn't shoot them. I mean, they were civilians. This was peacetime. It was England. So what we simply did was arrest them, put them in the back of a Land Rover, drive them miles off into the country and drop them and let them walk back to camp. Now, they were removed. 1988, when things were slightly better, relations were warming up, relations were getting more amicable. In 1988, the cruise missiles were removed, which was part of the strategic arms limitation talks. The camp stayed there until the year 2000. Now, what they were protesting about between 1988 and 2000, I have no idea. But they were actually pretty scruffy and pretty dirty. I mean, you could smell them a mile off. But there you go, legitimate protest in a democracy. Well, 1985 is also the year that Gorbachev came to power. Now, Gorbachev realized that the game was up. The Soviet Union could not carry on the way it was. He knew that liberalization was only going to encourage nationalist movements, particularly in the Baltic states, but elsewhere as well. And he announced that he was going to reform the Soviet Union in accordance with two principles: perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Openness in Russia, Soviet Union, unheard of. And he withdrew Soviet troops from Afghanistan. They pulled out in February 1989. Now, during the 10 years they were in Afghanistan, they deployed 14,500 troops. 14,500 had been killed, 9,500 killed in battle, the rest killed of disease and accident. 54,000 had been wounded, and 265 were missing, believed dead. Even during the withdrawal, there were 500 roughly killed, just withdrawing from Afghanistan. Well, then in May 1989, Hungary down here opened its border with Austria. So there's a breach in the Iron Curtain between Hungary and Austria. In East Germany, where Honecker, the head of state, had absolutely refused any liberalization whatsoever. He thought Gorbachev was a traitor to communism. He wouldn't have any truck with this liberalization. It remained a Stalinist, party's boot on your neck, don't step out of line regime. And increasingly, there'd been demonstrations. And when the Hungarians opened their border to Austria, East Germans started to come down, trek down through Czechoslovakia into Hungary and into Austria, and then, of course, into the West. And the demonstrations started to get violent. People were in East Germany demanding freedom. And Honecker said to Gorbachev, help, send Soviet troops. I can't trust my own army. Send Soviet troops to put these down. And Gorbachev said, you're on your own. And the result, of course, was that in November 1989, down came the Berlin Wall. And in 1990, on the 3rd of October, Germany was reunited. It cost the West Germans a fortune because they had to allow one Eastmark being the equivalent of one Westmark. Now, when I was in Berlin, you could get 8 Eastmarks for one Westmark. But of course, the West Germans government clearly had to say 1 for 1. Otherwise, everybody's savings in the East would have been worth nothing. So it cost the West a huge amount. Even today, traveling in the eastern bit of Germany, a bit of Germany that was Soviet occupied, you can see the difference. I mean, you can still see areas that are overgrown with weeds. You can still see buildings boarded up. You never see that in the West. I mean, obviously, there's tremendous effort to try and bring the eastern half up to the standard of the West. They've still got a bit of way to go. It's one of the few times when Mrs. Thatcher got it wrong. She didn't get many things wrong, but she called this one wrong. She was against German unification. She said, if you allow them to unify, they'll be up to their own tricks. Well, of course, that didn't happen. And the same year that Germany was reunited, the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, announced that they were withdrawing from the USSR. They'd been annexed to the USSR in 1940. There was an attempt in Lithuania to prevent that, which failed. And then in December 1991, finally it was clear that the game was up. The USSR simply could not survive. Down came the flag of the USSR, which is over the Kremlin, and up went the flag of the Russian Federation. And effectively, that was the end of the Cold War. And Boris Yeltsin becomes the first president of the Russian Federation. Now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you've got one country suddenly becomes 15, Russia and 14 others. Now, in countries like the Baltic states and Hungary, there is an experience, there is a race memory, if you like, of Western-style government, universal suffrage, democracy. So not too much of a problem there. But down here in the Caucasus, they had never been independent. Countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, they had either been part of Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire, or when the Mongol Empire fragmented, they'd been ruled by thoroughly unpleasant dictatorial Khans, or they had been part of Tsarist Russia, acquired during the Great Game of the 18th and 19th century, or they've been part of the USSR. And now suddenly, overnight almost, they're independent. What do they do? And what actually happened was that the people who'd been ruling the various countries as secretary generals of the Communist Party of Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, or whatever, simply changed their names and carried on much as they had been before. So it'll be quite interesting to see what goes on in that part of the world. It's a wonderful part of the world. It's fascinating, wonderful scenery, very interesting people. One of the good things that the Soviets did in the Caucasus was that they removed fundamentalism. They couldn't get rid of religion altogether. It was too strongly embedded. But they did turn fundamentalist Islam into Church of England Islam, if you like, liberal Islam. The first time I went to Uzbekistan, I had lunch with a Uzbek historian who spoke English, and he ordered a bottle of wine, which I thought was for me. And he poured himself a large glass, poured me a glass. And I said, "You're a Muslim?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, I thought you weren't allowed to drink." He said, He said, "In England, you have Coca-Cola Light?" And I said, "Yes, we do have Coca-Cola Light. I don't drink it, but we do have it." He said, "Here we have Islam Light." He said, "We drink, we eat what we like. We don't play 5 times a day." So they go to the mosque on a Friday. Their girls don't look like black letterboxes. They wear national costumes. They don't have to cover their heads. And this is a stone's throw from Afghanistan, which is one of the sources of extreme fundamental Islam. So that was one of the good things the Soviets did in the Caucasus. Well, I've talked about the Cold War, but of course there are huge amounts, aspects of the Cold War I haven't talked about because you haven't got 3 weeks to listen to me. I haven't talked about what was happening in South America. I haven't talked about the Vietnam War. I haven't talked about the Malayan campaign, the Borneo campaign. I haven't talked what was going on in Africa. And many of the tensions, of course, remain. In some ways, the world is actually more unstable than it was during the Cold War, because during the Cold War, there were two camps, and most countries, nearly everybody, was allied either to the West or to the Soviet Union. And that created a balance, because we could work out pretty well what the Soviets were likely to do, and they could work out pretty well what we were likely to do. Now, that's not the case anymore. The Balkans, the only people who were ever able to keep the Balkans in order were the Ottoman Empire and the communists, and we're not going to resurrect either of those two institutions. But many of those tensions, as I say, they still remain. Georgia, the Russians invaded Georgia in August 2008. There's the problems in the Ukraine, not only with the annexation of the Crimea, but the separatist movements in the East. There's the question of Syria, the question of ISIS. There are those who say maybe we're heading towards another Cold War. Well, I very much hope not. But there we are, and thank you very much indeed for listening to me. And if there are any questions, I'll try to answer them.
Oh, thank you very much, Major Corrigan, for another fascinating lecture that really was enjoyed by many guests. So thank you so much for everyone who's joined us as well for today. As I mentioned at the start, we have got time for some questions, and I know that we had some people sending some questions in before the lecture, and we've got a couple here. So I'll get straight to them if that's all right, Major Corrigan. It won't be a moment. So first is quite a general question. Do you think the Cold War was inevitable, and do you think any one party was to blame?
I think that it probably was inevitable. I mean, if you think back to the 30s, it wasn't Germany that people in the West were worried about. It wasn't Nazism that they were worried about. It was Bolshevism. It was what was going on in Russia. And I think it was 3 days before the Germans invaded Russia, Churchill was fulminating about I think, to quote him, the ravening beast of Bolshevism. Well, then, of course, once the Germans invaded Russia, he then said, well, if Hitler should invade hell, I will make a passing congratulatory message to the devil in the House of Commons. So in other words, your enemy's enemy is your friend, if you like. But Bolshevik Russia and the West were never going to get on together. I mean, I often think, and I'm sort of speculating now, but if the Great Depression hadn't happened, then the Weimar Republic in Germany might have survived. And that was the most democratic that Germany had ever been. But the Second World War would still have happened, but it would have been Germany, France, and Britain against the Soviet Union. So I think that once it was quite clear that the Soviets were going to have this buffer, they were in possession of half of Germany, Poland, Hungary, and all the rest of it. And they weren't going to give it up. And their whole sort of worldview was contrary to the Western worldview. When I say the Western, I mean mainly the British and the Americans. So I think the Cold War was always going to happen. I hope we're not going into another one. I really do. But at the moment, things are not looking too good. And I think actually that the Russians are being a bit silly at the moment. We could come to a modus vivendi with the Russians. I'm quite sure we could. It seems to me that we should be much more worried about China than about Russia. But yeah, I'm afraid I think it was inevitable. And I'm not saying it was anybody's particular fault, but I think it was a clash of two completely different world pictures, completely different ways of doing things. I mean, it's not just dictatorship versus democracy. It's much more complicated than that. But I think those two, they just weren't compatible, the Western way of doing things and the Soviet way of doing things.
No, that's fair enough. We had a question come in from during the presentation. In 1962, do you agree with the opinion that Khrushchev rescued the world from a nuclear war?
Well, you could say that Kennedy rescued the world from a nuclear war. Yeah, Khrushchev blinked first and agreed to remove his missiles. Had he not agreed to do that, I think probably, I mean, it's difficult to know what would happen, but of course, the American Navy was blockading it, so the Russians couldn't resupply their garrisons. And of course, the Americans had their base in Guantanamo anyway, in Cuba. I think, and it was the blockade really that made Khrushchev realize that his garrison in Cuba were going to wither on the vine because they couldn't be resupplied. They couldn't be replaced. And if the blockade went on, they were going to have to put their hands up. So I think it was better. And they were not then in a position to take the American Navy on, not when they were so near, when the American Navy was so near their own ports. I mean, the Black Sea Fleet, it would have had to have come out of the Black Sea through the Mediterranean off to America. The Baltic Fleet, out of the Baltic, the Northern Fleet would have been the nearest from Murmansk, but the Baltic Fleet wasn't in very good state actually then. So I think it was really, it's really the American blockade that made Khrushchev blink, and Khrushchev then agreed to remove his missiles.
Very diplomatic answer to that question, but thank you for answering that. We've had several of the questions come through, so I'll run through as many as I can now. But any that I can't obviously answer, or we can't answer live, we'll respond afterwards, because I know we're conscious of time now. But so one, we've got from a question here from Tamal, who's asked, you obviously were speaking about ballistic missiles and how expensive it is to stop missiles. So now we have the Patriot missiles of the US and the S-400 missiles of Russia. Which of the two do you think are more effective, and which are the least expensive?
Neither of them will stop. Neither of them will stop a ballistic missile. They will stop a short-range missile. They'll stop a cruise missile. They won't stop a ballistic missile. There is not yet, at least unless something's being developed that I know nothing about, there isn't an effective system for shooting down a ballistic missile. The only one I really know much about is the Patriot system, and that of course that's been used in the Gulf, both Gulf wars, when it was pretty effective, and it's been used by the Israelis to counter Palestinian missiles. So it's pretty effective as far as I know, and I haven't seen it, but as far as I know from people who have, the Russian system is very similar. The Russians are very good at reverse engineering. I mean, they will take something that they like the look of, and they'll effectively copy it, if you like. So the missile that the Buk missile, which is the one that shot down the Malaysian Airways plane over the Ukraine, that's not an anti-ballistic missile system. It's an anti-aircraft system. As far as I know, there is no reliable system for taking on ballistic missiles.
Hopefully that answers your question, Tamal. So thank you for sending that in. We have another question. Which American statesman led the charge to drive down the pound during the Suez Canal, with Julius being ill? Obviously you spoke about that earlier.
Well, there was a huge fuss in Congress and the Senate. Now you've got to remember that America essentially is anti-colonial, it's anti-imperialism, and the British are colonialists. I mean, just because we're allies in most things, and we share most of our values, we share, but there are certain things that we don't share, and the Americans have always been opposed to the British Empire. Largely, I think, I mean, Roosevelt was anti the empire because he thought that if the British Empire collapsed, then the various components would cleave to the US, and that would be good for American trade. It's not actually what happened, but that's what he thought. So here again is an example of the imperial power, whom we broke away from in 1775, taking on this inoffensive little country of Egypt. And there was no real, I mean, Dulles was sick. Eisenhower had to do what he was advised to do by his advisors. And the whole thing got out of hand, of course. And once a run on the pound or a run on any currency starts, of course, it gets worse and worse and worse because everybody piles in. You know, they see the currency going down. All right, sell, 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 sell. And it would have bankrupted us. I personally am of the view that we should have carried on and said two fingers to the lot of you. But that probably we could have got away with it if we didn't have a democratic government. We do have a democratic government. So it was very unfortunate. I mean, I think later on, you know, Dulles realized that actually this was not a good thing to do. And I think Eisenhower agreed it, so realized it as well. But of course, it was too late, and it led to all sorts of problems subsequently in the Middle East. I mean, some of which we're still living with them today.
And Peter Bram has asked what the current status is of the Ukraine, and how does Moldova fit within that politically?
Well, Moldova's pretty quiet at the moment. There's not too much of a problem there. The problem in the Ukraine is that a considerable proportion of the citizens of the Ukraine living in the east of the Ukraine are actually ethnic Russians. And that's what the Dnestia separatism is about. There was a frightful fuss in the West over the annexation of the Crimea, largely by people who don't study history, because the Crimea was taken by Catherine the Great from the Ottomans in 1783 during one of those constant Russian-Turkish wars which they keep happening. And it was part of Russia. No argument. The staff has just brought me a gin and tonic. Thank you. Good idea. Most kind. Thank you.
I think I could do with this service myself.
It was Russian. Now, in 1958, I can't remember the exact date, but Khrushchev decided, look at the map. Ukraine is a Soviet Socialist Republic. It's part of the USSR. Administratively, rather than try to administer the Crimea from Russia, administer it from the Ukraine. Easy. And that made total sense. Ukraine was part of the USSR. Now, come the collapse, the fragmentation of the Soviet Union, the Russians could have negotiated the Crimea back into Russia, but it all happened far too quickly. And I used to go, we're not allowed to go to Crimea now, sadly. I used to go to the Crimea a lot. And most of the Crimeans, this was before Putin annexed it, most people in the Crimea will either say, actually, I'm Russian, or I'm a Ukrainian and a Russian. A lot of the sailors of the Baltic, the Black Sea Fleet, which is based in Sevastopol, and was still based in Sevastopol by agreement with the Ukrainians, retired in the Crimea. It's a nice place to be. Climate's good, people are nice, scenery's good. So to get terribly pole-faced and grumpy because the Russians decide, oh crikey, we should have kept the Crimea. We didn't, right? We'll grab it now. It had always been Russian, and the people saw themselves really being as Russian rather than Ukrainians. What we hear nothing about is the Budapest Memorandum. Now, there's a thing called the Budapest Memorandum, which was signed in 1991 or 1992. I can't remember the exact date, but it was signed by the UK, the US, and the Russian Federation. And it guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine giving up nuclear weapons. Because when the Soviet Union fragmented, the various bits of the Soviet armed forces went to the constituent republics, and there had been nuclear weapons stationed in the Ukraine. So Ukraine has nuclear weapons. So the Americans, the British, and the Russians said, we will guarantee your integrity, but you give up use of weapons, which they did. We didn't hear anything about the Budapest Memorandum when the Russians snaffled the Crimea. I'm afraid I'm totally on the side of the Russians on this one. The Crimea was always Russian. It's still Russian. So stop fussing about it. What is wrong is, of course, they are supporting the separatism in Dnestia by quote unquote volunteers, and they're arming and encouraging those. In a way, easy for me to say, because we've never been invaded, never been occupied, well, not since the Romans, and that's quite a long time ago. But somewhere like Estonia, the Estonians, 24% of the Estonian population is actually ethnically Russian. And the Estonians, quite senior Estonian was saying to me, and we're not having this, we've stopped this Russian language school, we've stopped Russian, Russian's not a foreign official language anymore. And I said, well, isn't that unwise? I mean, 24% are Russian, ethnic Russians. Why not make them feel welcome? Make them feel that they're Estonians rather than Russians. Let them have Russian language schools. Why not? And he said, well, you wouldn't do it in England. I said, well, actually, as a matter of fact, the Welsh language is spoken by two very old men and a dog who live on the top of a mountain. And everything in Wales, now I'm now going to get stoned by Welsh listeners, everything in Wales is written in both languages. So we would do it, we do it. Why don't you? But again, the Estonians, and indeed all of the Baltic states, really resent their occupation by the Soviets, which was a pretty harsh occupation. And they just are not, they're not prepared to let bygones be bygones. It'll take another generation probably before all that'll settle down. And there's much, the Ukraine has got problems as well. If you remember, the Ukrainians at one stage, I think it was, I can't remember which, no, Lukashenko, wanted to join, talked about joining the EU and joining NATO. And the Russians weren't going to have that. So again, it's all these tensions that were under control during the Cold War are now out in the open again. I can't remember what the question was.
I think you know, thank you so much for answering those questions in so much detail. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, it's so difficult to try and to speak about all of the different aspects of the Cold War in one lecture. And I think obviously that's just from the questions that we've had, it's unfortunate we can't answer them all, but we will, as I mentioned earlier, I will respond to everyone that we've not been able to answer live. I'll respond to you by email with the answers to your questions. Obviously I'm conscious of time, so thank you for everyone who's listened, and thank you, Gordon, for giving up your time today to speak to us all. Someone did ask whether these lectures are lectures that take place on board the Golden Eagle trains, and yes, they are. This is what we would usually do when obviously we are operating tours. We would have a guest speaker travel with us on board the tour and deliver some lectures that are relevant to the sort of tour that you're traveling on. So Major Corrigan's travelled with us on many Silk Road Caspian, sorry, and the Trans-Siberian journeys as well. So,
but you won't. Don't worry. You don't think that because you've heard this lecture now, you're going to have to sit through it again on the train, because you're not. I change the lectures each time. I don't give the same talk each time. So
that's good to know. But even so, I think hearing lectures, I mean, I don't know about everyone else, but I can't take it in all at one time. So I like to listen to them back and hear them again. So even if it was, I don't think that would.
Well, I would talk about the same subject, but there are all sorts of other aspects. I wouldn't talk about it. It wouldn't be exactly the same lecture. It'll be the same subject, but not exactly the same lecture. Because if it's the same thing every time, I'm going to get very bored. If I get bored, by God, you're going to be bored. So I try to, change it each time.
Thank you for everyone sending them lovely messages. I will pass those on to Major Corrigan. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your evening, wherever you are. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon.